Welcome. I am Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this is Today with Dr. Kaye, where we talk about the stories that matter. If it is important, if it is interesting, if it is happening in your community or around the country, and if it has your ear, then it has my attention. Prior to the election of President Trump, the news was consumed with Black Lives Matter. But lately, we haven't heard much at all. What is happening with the movement, and where do we go from here? In our second hour, we speak with nationally recognized writer and Princeton professor Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor about her book, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and we get those answers. Earlier this week, when the television show Blackish dedicated their season opener to talking about June 10th, which is June 19th, 1865, Juneteenth Day, and the ending of American enslavement, I must admit that the historian in me was appalled that the date that is used to celebrate the ending of American enslavement in Texas was assumed to be the date that American enslavement writ large ended in this country. I started asking people. I asked my students, my sons, family members, random strangers, what year did American enslavement legally end in this country, and how did it end? I heard answers that range from 1697 up to 1954. Many people thought it had ended with the Emancipation Proclamation. Someone said at the ending of Brown v. Board. Some folks argued that it hadn't ended at all. Slavery is an essential thread that makes up the fabric of our country. It is an issue that we're still wrestling with. We're still trying to make sense of it, and we're still trying to free ourselves from the vestiges that effectively set up a system of white supremacy and black inferiority. It is essentially the most effective advertising campaign ever created. It is a system of erasure, where we learn over and over again that there is a thread called American history, and there's a separate thread called Black history. Folks, let's be real. Black history is American history, and we must work to dismantle the lie that continues to perpetuate that our lives, our history, and our contributions are not a part of the American story. We must force this country, our country, to be and do better. Make no mistake about it, I love my country with a passion, and that is why I believe it is absolutely worthy of critique. We must write a narrative that seeks to create, either voluntarily or forcefully, a freedom space that celebrates Black and brown joy, Black and brown love, and that recognizes in a very fundamental way Black and brown strands of pain. This is the history, the one that recognizes our tears and our laughter that we should be studying and memorizing. People can tell you all the words to Jay-Z's song, but they can't tell you what's in the First Amendment. They can talk for days about Beyonce or Kanye, but they cannot explain in a clear way why Colin Kaepernick has the constitutional right to kneel. I think we need to get more educated about our rights, because this is how we fight and this is how we win. I would suggest that everyone go back and study the First Amendment, which not only grants us the freedom of press, speech, and the free exercise of religion, but it also grants us the right to peacefully assemble and the right to petition the government for redress of grievances. We can demand that Donald Trump make some changes. We have the constitutional right to do that. And before I forget, American enslavement legally ended on December 6, 1865, with the ratification of the 13th Amendment. It effectively ended involuntary servitude everywhere but in prison. Come on, folks. Learn your history, study your history, and know your history. What only started with two friends in Los Angeles, California, became a nationwide movement to get Black women to think about the health and their health in a positive way, simply by walking or running. 2010 Girl Trek challenged women, friends, mothers, daughters, aunts, and even grandmothers to walk as a way of healing their bodies and inspiring their community. This is Today with Dr. Kaye here on WEAA 88.9 FM. Stay with us after the break for more conversation.
Absolutely. And again, thank you for this opportunity to be with you and to share. So in 2011, the Campaign for Black Male Achievement established Rumble Young Man Rumble, a convening for leaders, that's men and women who are working with or on behalf of Black men and boys across the country. And since then, it's been an annual event, a very small convening held at the Muhammad Ali Center in Louisville, Kentucky. And the focus of that convening really has been to gather, to learn, to share, and to really get what we need as leaders in this work to move forward and continue doing the work. Since actually since the beginning of 2017, the campaign decided that, we need to continue to offer the Rumbles in Louisville, Kentucky as a national convening, but actually bring the Rumbles to our core cities as a beginning. And CBMA's core cities are Milwaukee, Oakland, Detroit, Baltimore, and Louisville, Kentucky. So earlier this year, we had our first regional convening in Detroit, Michigan, and you are experiencing, and several of our colleagues are experiencing here in Baltimore, the second such regional convening where we're having conversations that connect us, that compel us to do the work, and that catalyze us to continue to do the work here in Baltimore.
Well, we know here in Baltimore, we have a lot of issues that we confront. We're dealing at this point with over 270 homicides that have taken place this year alone, with a population of only 620,000. And so as you drill down deep onto the young Black men, what do you think are some of the big issues that they're struggling with here in our city?
I mean, we know what those issues are. We've been talking about them. Imam Earl El-Amin, who actually was one of my mentors. He wrote a paper many years ago. He and his brother co-authored a paper many years ago that they called the 5 Ps, relative to the challenges that that young Black men and, frankly, Black men and boys in Baltimore faced. And I would just refer folks to Brother Earl El-Amin. I would refer folks to brothers like Davon Love and Adam Jackson in the Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle, and all the other youth leaders that are here who can catalog the challenges. And those challenges really come from, of course, persistent poverty and persistent pain in this city.
Now, people are familiar with Leaders of a Beautiful Struggle. They are definitely friends to our station, and the work that they're doing, not just to push the agenda around young Black boys, but also to push the agenda around Black people in this city. But with those boys, what are some of the key moments that you think that the boys walked away with? Was it having that conversation? Was it reflecting? Like, what do you think?
So I think that I think it's not only the conversations, but it's the opportunity to connect with people who care and are willing to listen. All too often, I think as we get older, if we have the opportunity to get older, we tend to want to pour into young people so much that we don't stop and listen to the wisdom that they're bringing forth. They are not only the canaries in the coal mine, they have had to become their own filters. And as a result, they are learning things that it might have taken some adults a lifetime to figure out. And so they have, I think what they're gaining is a newfound respect for, and a newfound set of ears, collectively and individually, from these people that they are talking to and listening with.
And if people are not familiar with the analogy of the canaries and the coal miners, that the coal miners would take a canary down there, so when there's a problem with the oxygen levels, when the canary passes out, it's a way of signaling to them that they need to leave quickly before they're next. So this idea that you're saying our young Black boys across the United States, but in Baltimore more specifically, are like canaries, that they are alerting us to some deeper, darker, more serious issues that we need to wrestle with.
Absolutely, and have been wrestling with, and these issues are systemic, they are pervasive, they are ever-present, and they're asymmetric. And so our boys are recognizing that, they're seeing that. The question is, what's the response? And as they look to the adults, as they look to folks who should have, and they would hope would have the answer, sometimes the answer is not there. But in this space, we have many people who also have people and represent systems that are looking and have been working and trying to figure this out. And so I think what these young men are going to see is that, in fact, they have a place in this conversation, that their voice is not only welcome but is needed, and that it's respected, and that their experiences their lived experiences are respected and are being heard, and that we're working hard, that the people in the room who are leading the work and doing the work are working hard to clear the way and filter, so that we don't have as many canaries in the coal mine passing away from the lack of oxygen and the toxicity that does exist.
Now, I will say that as a mother, and my listeners know that I'm raising two teenage boys here in Baltimore City, I'm getting really frustrated, Steve. I feel like we talk about this problem all the time. I feel like we're always trying to come up with solutions, but nothing is changing. So as you're dealing with the rumble around the country, are you really seeing some results? And can we expect those results here in Baltimore City?
So I think we are. The challenge is what we're looking for. And part of the challenge is when we say we want results, and again, this goes to what are people looking for? And you will see, if you're willing, you'll see what you're looking for. So in other words, if the narrative, and this is why storytelling becomes so important and narrative change becomes so important, if the narrative is going to be that there's a lot happening, but ain't a lot changing or ain't a lot going on, which has been a narrative for a long time, then what tends to happen is that's what our filters show us. But if you were willing to, and not just you, but if our listeners are willing to look around and see who's doing the work, where are they doing the work, what kind of work are they doing, all of a sudden you find this vast constellation of people who are moving and pushing and shaking, and they're not just your usual suspects. That's a whole other thing. They're not the people you would typically expect to be the folks who would be making changes. And so I would submit to the audience that there are people in Baltimore City who are doing and have been doing heroic work under tremendous pressure without the resource. The story in Baltimore has been, for the longest time, the needs are great and the resources are few. However, we still have managed, particularly as black people in this city, we still have managed to turn out leaders and college graduates and people who are contributing, and not just that, and not just college graduates, people who work every day in different industries, work every day, whether it's changing tires or changing lives, to better this city and to really contribute to the city. And so these folks exist, they're out there, and they need not just the funding that's available when money flies through after crisis, but they need the support of the people who live here who are willing to roll up their sleeves and join them in this battle. We cannot leave our warriors out there fighting on their own. They need your support. That's the support of the listeners to this station, the support, this village. We need to activate this village and continue to activate. So I would say to you, that's a long diatribe, a lot of words. I would say to you, people are out here. They've been doing the work. We got to see them, and we got to support them. And in that way, we continue to seed the community that we want to see.
Now, one of the things that I wrestle with when I think about raising my own boys, I know what winning looks like in their lives, right? So for us as parents, my husband and I, winning means that you're getting the good grades. Winning means that when I drop you off at school, I am picking you up and you have had a day where things have been poured into you. Winning means that you still can dream about who you want to be in this world. For the Rumble, what does the win look like?
For us, it's very clear that if we can get people to articulate what is stopping us from actually working together to achieve a win in Baltimore City for black men and boys, and really for boys and men of color, that's a win. If we can get people to begin to lay down the weaponry amongst themselves and to begin to ally against a common enemy, that is the win. And I think that and for us, the win is also to begin to figure out who we're going to hold accountable and how we're going to hold each other accountable. And not do so. And accountability doesn't mean coming in, as a colleague of mine just said several days ago, accountability is not just equated with who's bringing the bats and clubs to bring people back in line. That's not accountability. Accountability is, how do I hold you up? How do I help hold you up? And how do we put together so that we can get towards the win?
Now,
how do we work as a team and as a unified group to make it happen for our boys and young men here in this city? And so that, for us, is the win.
Okay, well, one of the things that we like to do here on Today with Dr. Kaye is we like people to walk away with practical information. As you said, it was a long diatribe, and I'm glad that you cut in. I wanted you to finish your statement, but we like people to walk away with practical information. So for parents or for pastors or for community leaders, what are 3 things that they can do immediately that you think can help young black men in this city?
So one is actually go and find and collect and be with and listen to and talk to a young black man or 2 or 5 or 10 or 100. Do that now. The second thing is to connect with the families in the community. You cannot do this work and solely be focused on the young men. You must remember that they come from context, and that context includes a family. And we've got to support that family, and that's regardless of our own biases. If you can get around your own biases, it's regardless of that stuff, and focus on, yes, what we can deliver and will deliver for the young people. The last and the third and the last is that we who are doing the work, we who are saying we're supposed to be helping, need to check ourselves. We need to know and understand what our biases are. We need to get very clear about what those biases are. And, if you're not willing to get over yourself, then stay away. Don't do 1 or 2. As a matter of fact, you're in the way. You're the definition of what's in the way, because you're just perpetuating the problems that our young people are facing and dealing with. So those are my top 3, is to get with the young men themselves, is to bring your wisdom, is to connect with their families and the people they care about, and the third is to make sure that we're checking ourselves before we do number 1 and number 2.
Oh, thank you so much. Steve Vassar, who is the director of Rumble, Young Man Rumble. The Rumble is taking place here in Baltimore City until tomorrow. We appreciate your time, sir.
Thank you.
And this is Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead. Stay with us after the break for a conversation from Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation with Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead from Today with Dr. Kaye. We will have Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor at the top of the hour, but now we want to hear from you. Stay with us after our next very, very short break. We want to open up the phones. We want to talk about the ways in which we reach out to black boys in this city. Do you have tips for what you're doing to communicate better with your son? I don't want to forget the girls, so what can we do to help black girls in this city? Give us a call at 410-319-8888. That's 410-319-8888. After the break, I'm listening. Welcome back to Today with Dr. Kaye. I have the phone lines open here at 410-319-8888, WEAA 88.9 FM, and I want to talk to you. We just heard from Steve Vassar for the Campaign for Black Male Initiative, and he's talking about the Rumble Young Man Rumble. They are down at the Lewis Museum today, and what they have done in this city is they're pulling together young Black boys from all over the city to talk about what it means to imagine a different kind of life. What does it mean to kind of dream out loud? I was actually down there with them today, and I just thought it was an amazing conversation to hear from the boys, to hear some of the things they're struggling with, to hear from the activists in the city. What does it mean for a city to say that they love and they support Black children, but they're not putting the money into what that looks like? We had activists on the ground really challenging the ways in which we allocate funds in this city. What does it say for a city that spends more money on police officers than we do on schools? What do you think? Do you think that Baltimore City needs to take a really long, hard, loving look at the real and think about what we're doing? Are we actually doing the kind of work we should be to change the lifestyles of young people in this city? 410-319-8888. One of the things that someone said today is he said that education is not enough, that we always hear that education is the answer for everything, and education leads to a plethora of opportunities, but what they're finding is that education is not enough. You can go to school, you can get your high school diploma, but that doesn't translate into more opportunities. You can go and get your BA. It doesn't necessarily translate to more opportunities. So much research has come out this year that's showing how we have this systemic inequality in this country, and that even if a Black family, if they have their master's degrees and in some cases their PhDs, they still end up making less money over the long haul than white families who have a high school diploma. I mean, if you want a real look at what systemic inequality looks like, while we talk about white supremacy, we can simply look at the structures in this city. I think a lot about the Black butterfly and the white L, and I'm sure you do too. And if you're thinking, how can we break that up? And you're thinking about what we can do, this is what we struggle with. I mean, thinking this is what keeps me up at night. I'm thinking of ways that we can rearrange this city. How do we push people who are economically challenged into the communities where they can have more opportunities? I'm sure you think the same thing. I wonder the last time you rode through the White L. I tend to ride through there every once in a while to remind myself that there is a real serious problem with neighborhood segregation in this city. I'm at 410-319-8888. Here on Today with Dr. Kaye, we're trying to talk about and tell the stories that matter. A couple things that came out today, which I thought was really interesting, is that Steve Vassar started by saying that we want to liberate the truth that is already in the room. That actually reminded me of how we have those down-home family reunions. I'm sure you have them as well. But I remember going into the family reunions, and I remember seeing all of my uncles who would sit at the table. Now, as a young child, they would not let me play spades. Spades was my family's game. Some families play Monopoly. Some play gin rummy. We played spades. And I used to watch my uncles and aunts play vicious games of spade. And so my grandmother would say, we have to tell the truth. The truth's already in the room. Who's the one that's going to win? This is how I grew up, watching them kind of commenting and work with one another, but they were looking to get the truth out about who was the most vicious spades player. Now, when he said this today about liberating the truth that was already in the room, it took me right back to that place of being that young girl and watching my aunts and uncles, the men and women that I looked up to, the ones that I loved, the ones that modeled for me what it meant to be a talent and Black love and Black hope and responsibility. It took me right back to that place. And I thought about the young boys in this city, wondering if they had people in their lives that they can look up to, people that they can kind of imagine themselves. What do you think about a Baltimore City? Do you think that we should find more disruption activities, more ways to have young Black men going into the elementary schools, going into the middle schools, finding ways to do a different kind of Big Brother program where we're actually pouring as much as we can into these young boys, because this is the future that we're talking about. The other thing I thought was interesting, I asked the participants, because I moderated this conversation, I asked them to think about two things. What are we fighting for, and what are we fighting against? That if we're looking at this campaign for Black male achievement, what are we fighting for? So these are some of the things. And I want you to think about it and give me a call at 410-319-8888 and tell me if you agree. Maybe you have some other ideas. But some of the things we were fighting for, we were fighting for equality, for a sense of peace, fighting for our voices to be heard. What was interesting that came up a couple of times is quite a few young Black men in the room said that they were fighting for identity, not just as Black men, but they were fighting to be seen as equals here in this country. One older man said that somewhere along the line, young Black men have stopped dreaming. And so what we're fighting for is we're fighting for their right to dream. We talked about fighting for the Black family and finding ways to put that forward. I asked the young Black men to write down for me what did they want to learn. And one young man said, I'd like to learn why so many of us don't have daddies in the household. How do we speak truth into our young Black men? We're opening up the phone calls. We have Betty from Columbia, Maryland. Betty, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Thank you very much for having me on the show. I just wanted to throw it out there that maybe we need to consider starting even earlier. Mm-hmm. Let's look at our early childhood education systems, our religious systems, whatever systems we have, our societal systems into which these children are born, and begin to address the problem even before it really comes to the fore. Because by the time the child is in elementary school, a lot of that child's personality and a lot of that child's worldview is already formed.
So, Betty, let me ask you. Before you get off the phone, I have another question for you, Betty, and I thank you for calling me. So when we start talking about doing something earlier, kind of being a disruptor earlier, are you looking at, 5, 6 years old? Are you looking at 4 or 5? Or you're talking about as soon as they're born into this world to start speaking this new truth over them?
I'm talking about, for our Black boys, we are in a time of crisis. So I'm talking about when they are born. As a society, as a person of color, what can I bring to the table to that child? And so that child doesn't grow up. For those of us that live in suburbia, and you drive and you see some of these young Black men and you're like, it's the other. You know what I mean? When you should really see in that Black man your own son, your own brother, your own neighbor, and love him. Because until we can love like the children love and see like they love, we have a long way to go.
Now, I want to ask you one more question, Betty. So I want to get all this knowledge from you before you get off the phone here. So what do you do when you encounter young Black men who don't want you to love on them? Like, what do we do in that situation?
Can you repeat the question, please?
So what do we do when we encounter young Black men who are a little bit older than 4, 5, and 6 years old into elementary and middle school? They don't want you to love on them because that love is something that they're not comfortable with. What do we do in that situation?
But inside every human being is a sense of what is right and wrong. And inside every human being, especially in our children, is that need for security. Love is a big word, even for the children. So we don't maybe say love, but we express love to them in our actions. And in that, they will come to love because they will know love. Love is an action.
Thank you so much, Betty. Thank you for calling Today with Dr. Kaye. Trying to have this place where we're telling the stories that matter. I want to thank my guest, Steve Vassar, the director of Young Man Rumble, for bringing that program here to Baltimore City. I want to thank the Lewis Museum because they hosted this space. And I really do want to thank all the young Black men who came down today from schools all across the city, and they wanted to learn how to dream differently. They wanted to learn how to have a different type of conversation. I am Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this is Today with Dr. Kaye here on WEAA 88.9 FM. After the break, we speak with nationally recognized author Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor and find out what does it mean to move from Black Lives Matter to Black liberation. This is Today with Dr. Kaye. Stay tuned for an update on MTA. Welcome back. I'm Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this is Today with Dr. Kaye, where we discuss the stories that matter. If it has your ear, then it has my attention. We're rolling out a new segment called A Writer with Writers, where I sit down with some of the most interesting and exciting writers around the country, talking about their books and their politics and delving into their writing practices. I am so excited to have our first guest on this new segment, and it is Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. She's a writer, public speaker, activist, and assistant professor at the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author of one of the best-selling books and one of the best books I've read in a very long time, From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation, and the forthcoming How We Get Free, Black Feminism and the Combahee River Collective, which is going to roll out just in time for the upcoming National Women's Studies Association Conference taking place right here in Baltimore next month. Keeanga, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
I am excited, and I'm going to tell people in full transparency that I was on a panel with you on Saturday, and a lot of the ideas I want to talk about, I would love to pick up from that point and go forward with, if that is okay with you.
Sure.
So on this panel, and this builds on the work that you're doing as both an activist and a writer, you were talking about the voting rights era, and you were talking about the fact that politicians on both sides are taking for granted the black vote. Can you talk a bit about that, please?
Well, I think that we've seen over the last several decades the pendulum in formal politics in the United States move increasingly and more recently quite rapidly to the right, so much so that you can have someone like Donald Trump elected as president. So in effect, there no longer is really a center in American politics. And what I mean by that is all of American politics, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, operate on the right wing of the political spectrum. And so, of course, there's a spectrum, on that, the right from, conservatism to Donald Trump's open kind of adoration of racist, of Islamophobes. And so there's an extremist edge to that. But the politics of, believing in a robust social safety net, of believing that the federal government has an obligation to take care of its population, and the idea that the private sector should not be involved in the distribution of public services. Those are foreign concepts within governance in the United States today. And so when you have a population, whether it's Latinos, but specifically African Americans, who are disproportionately poor and disadvantaged because of racism and discrimination in our economic system and in the way that public goods are distributed, the lack of attention to those types of public services, to programs that whose intention is to mitigate the effects of poverty, the absence of those have a detrimental impact in Black and Brown communities. But there's no party with which to appeal to for those things. And so that creates a problem for Black and Brown people in terms of, who do you lodge your grievances with? What are the means by which you try to affect social change? And where do you go to try to attend to these problems? And I think that the absence of that kind of outlet for people is really the context within which we have to understand the development of not just Black Lives Matter, but really the beginnings of an emergence
of all kinds of movements to address these issues that really are not necessarily looking to the established political parties to change that dynamic, but are really questioning, are there other ways to achieve what we need and what we want?
I think it's interesting, just to add to this, Kianga, that we're now living in a very different time. There was a time in American history when academics would speak out, and it wasn't as if you were in fear of your lives. There were small points here and there, but this is a very different environment. And one of the things that I thought was very interesting is that earlier this year, when you did your commencement speech that everybody talked about, of course, but that all of a sudden we really begin to look at and dig down into the ways in which being an academic and choosing to speak out against this current government puts you in a very tenable position. For academics who are kind of sitting on the fence, who want to write that op-ed where they challenge the policy and they back it up with their historical research, or they want to come on a show and speak out against this current administration, could you talk a little bit about the price that people have to be willing to pay if you want to stand up against this administration at this time?
I think that, everyone has to decide for themselves how to respond to the crisis that exists in the United States right now. And, I don't think anyone can suggest or, tell people how to do that, or even offer up insight into what may happen as a result. I mean, it's all very kind of unpredictable. But I do think that, there's a huge political vacuum that exists in the country right now, and people are clamoring for history, for politics, for explanations, for what has happened, and importantly, I think most people want to know what to do and how to respond. And so, for me, I draw on my experiences as an activist, as an organizer, that has looked to social movements of the past, has looked to the power that comes from the ability of ordinary people to organize themselves independently of moneyed interest or independent of the corporate political parties as a way to really advance an agenda that is in our own interest. And so I think that the default in the climate that we're in right now should be towards collective action, towards the politics of solidarity, meaning that you're not just reacting to things that happen to you or people that you know or that directly impact you, but that there's a greater effort to see how our struggles overlap and are really dependent upon each other to build the kind of successful coalition, successful movements to challenge the political status quo right now.
You talked when we were in Cincinnati, Ohio, you were talking about how this system where whites are increasingly becoming kind of the smallest racial group in this country, and that you were arguing that America is really on its way to setting up an apartheid system here, where those in the smallest numbers will have kind of the greatest amount of power. Can you talk a little bit about that, expand on that, and then talk about what we can do to perhaps stop that if we can?
I got the apartheid system. I missed the first part of your question.
Yes. No, thank you for asking me just to kind of go back over that. But I was building on something that you said in Cincinnati, Ohio. You were talking about how you believe that at this moment that the white population, who are increasingly becoming the minority, are in the process of setting up the conditions for an apartheid system. Can you talk a bit about this as well as outline some things that we can do to keep this from happening?
Well, I mean, I don't necessarily think that is the scenario that we're facing. If anything, I think that policies of the Trump administration, or at least the policies that they're trying to advance, they haven't really gotten very much done, represent a threat to anyone who, is not rich and powerful in the United States. So actually, I think that the possibilities of developing the kinds of coalitions and collective action I mentioned before with ordinary white people, at least objectively in terms of the conditions that people face, that there is a basis for arguing for such a thing. But the limit on those types of coalitions has always been a subjective or political one, which is, basically how do you get people to see that their interests are connected to each other? How do you get ordinary white people to see that even though racism is the burden of black people and of brown people, that it also constitutes a problem in their lives as well. And what I mean by that is if the federal government spends $80 billion a year to maintain a racist criminal justice system that obviously has a disproportionate impact on the lives of black and brown people, then that is clearly a burden for black people. But the federal, tax dollars, $80 billion in tax dollars going towards maintaining a criminal justice system is also a problem for ordinary white people who still look to public schools to educate their children, particularly outside of major metropolitan or urban areas. It represents a problem for people who look to the federal government to bolster funding for public hospitals, so on and so forth. Another example I always like to point out is how Bill Clinton used racist stereotypes of black women to help end the system of welfare as a social entitlement in 1996. But at that point in time, the majority of people receiving welfare payments were white women. And so even though racism was used to cut black women out from having access to white women or to having access to welfare, it was also white women who suffered the consequences of those decisions. And so I think that, if you look around this country, there is an enormous amount of economic hardship, economic anxiety, stress about what the future holds. And unfortunately, we have two political parties, one to the extreme, but the Democratic Party certainly engages in the politics of stereotypes and blame. We have a political system that blames the poorest people, the most disenfranchised people, for that economic arrangement. Donald Trump wants us to believe that the biggest problem in the lives of poor and working class people is black crime, Mexican immigrants, and Muslim terrorism. And so these are the politics of racism, the politics of divide and conquer. And so I think that even though it appears that these are politics that are parroted by most white people, I don't think that that's true. But even in a case where it is true, the question for me is it actually advancing their economic interest, or is it reinforcing an excuse used by the most powerful elite people in this country to continue not to do anything to alleviate the conditions that exist in communities of working class people across this country, and continue to blame the poorest, most marginalized, and weakest people in the country?
Now, if you just joined us, you're listening to Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead, and I'm on with Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor from Princeton University, the author From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Keeanga, we asked a number of high schools around the city, and they had their students read your book. and they were engaging with your book in their classrooms. And I asked them to give me questions that I could share with you, and they're listening for these answers. So if it's okay with you, I'm going to throw out some of the questions that these 10th, 11th, and 12th grade students wanted to know. So this is from a young lady, and she wants to know, do you think that the Black Lives Matter deaths that happened were a direct result of the Obama presidency?
Were they No, I don't think that they were the police killings. I'm assuming is being asked about. No, I don't think at all that they were a direct result of the Obama presidency. I mean, police brutality, racism, and policing has a very long history in the United States that certainly didn't develop in the Obama presidency. I think what I'm trying to say about the dynamic between Black Lives Matter and the Obama administration is that young Black people, Black millennials, in 2008 really put a lot of hope in voting for Barack Obama to be president. Young Black people had the largest turnout that they've ever had in a presidential election in 2008 and then again in 2012. And what came with that was the expectation that the nation's first Black president could actually do something about the conditions of racism and inequality that feed police abuse and violence in Black communities across the country. And his, not just, whether he's able or not is a different question, but really his unwillingness to really engage with this issue of police murder and police brutality. I mean, he really doesn't begin to speak about this until the last couple of years of his administration, and then it was because there was a full-scale movement afoot. And so part of why I argue that Black Lives Matter emerges when it does is because young people are quickly disillusioned. They have the hope and the expectation that the nation's first Black president will intervene on their behalf, will do something to stop the incidents of police abuse, police brutality, police murder, and he doesn't. In fact, most of his energy is geared towards lecturing Black people, especially young Black people, on how they should act and behave, that would somehow create a buffer with the police, that would somehow change police attitudes towards Black communities. If young Black men had a better attitude or dressed differently. And I think that the frustration of young Black people over the unwillingness of the president to really take that seriously, and then with his seeming inability to do anything produces the Black Lives Matter movement, where people, I think I'd say at the end of chapter 4, the young people realized that they would have to do it themselves, and so it's a more kind of complicated reaction, but that's what I was trying to describe.
Now, this student wants to know, she's in the 12th grade, and she said that prior to the election of Donald Trump, whenever she would do a Black Lives Matter activity at the school, and she attends a predominantly white school, she would have a lot of support, what we call allies. But she's saying ever since the election of Donald Trump, it's hard to get people to either care or be involved. So she wants to know, do you have strategies for how she can get this back into the front of people's minds?
Well, I think, the election of Donald Trump is, of course, terrifying and demoralizing for millions of people. And so, at the same time, I think that there's a sense of urgency to act and to respond to various aspects of his political agenda. I think that people can feel overwhelmed because his administration has attacked people on many different levels, so that it's difficult to know what to do or when to do it, because every time you kind of orient to a particular issue, there's another attack. It's nuclear war one week, it's deportations the next week, it's gun control or the lack thereof this week. Who knows what it'll be next week? And so it's a very challenging environment to try to organize in. But I think that part of what you have to do is to perhaps make the issues less about Trump and around taking up specific campaigns, which I think that you can do as Black Lives Matter organizers. I think that we can do that as people who consider ourselves a part of the Black Lives Matter movement have to be able to take up other issues to show the connection between the struggle against racism and other aspects of the agenda here. So it could mean taking up the issue of deportation and raids and the attacks on immigrant communities. It could mean taking up a particular aspect of a campaign against Islamophobia and the attacks on Muslims. It could be making specific calls around how to react to police brutality. It could be making demands such as insisting that the Trump administration not hand over military hardware to local police departments. So I would suggest one is being more narrow in the plans for the activism. And two, I think the main thing that people want to do right now is to talk and try to understand what's happening. And so I would encourage that student or any other student, high school or college students, is to actually organize forums on your campus or that are directed at students to create a place where people can talk about what is happening, try to wrap their heads around why it's happening, and then plan collective actions out of those types of meetings.
This is Today with Dr. Kaye, and I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead here on WEAA 88.9 FM. I'm talking to Dr. Keeanga Yamada Taylor on A Writer with Writers. When we come back after the break, we're going to open up the phone lines. Do you have questions about what it means to be free? What does it mean to move from Black Lives Matter to Black liberation? What do we do to press against this current system? We have Dr. Taylor on the line to answer your calls at 410-319-8888. Stay with us.
Did you miss your favorite WEAA public affairs show this week? Not to worry. You can listen to the podcast online at weaa.org by clicking the Public Affairs tab. You can also subscribe to our podcast on iTunes. Simply search the show name and press subscribe. Your podcast will automatically update on your iTunes library. We are keeping you informed on your source for cool jazz and more. WEAA 88.9 FM. Support for WEAA is provided by
Charm TV, the City of Baltimore's premier TV station, has a new season of programming featuring your neighborhood on shows like My Town, Neighborhood Lights Revealed, and Who We Are, or Game Changers that provides updates on Baltimore's government. It's all about Charm TV, Mondays and Wednesdays starting at 8 p.m., channels 25 and 1085 on Comcast and charmtv.tv. Charm TV, Baltimore, all the time.
And members like you. Thank you.
Mornings with Mikkel, something new on WEAA 88.9. If you had fun on Wednesday, tune in on Thursday. It gets even crazier.
That's right. We've got a story about Tyrese. And everybody thinks Tyrese is the model father. But I hear there's a little difference to the story. He's being investigated by Child Protective Services. So we're going to talk about that.
Oh, my goodness. Also, on the mark, my take on this crazy world we live in.
It's all going down on Mornings with Mikkel, WEAA 88.9, the voice of the community.
This is a two-way conversation. Phone lines are open. Join in on the discussion. First-time callers are encouraged. Questions or comments? 410-319-8888.
Welcome back. I'm Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this is Today with Dr. Kaye. I'm joined here by nationally recognized author and speaker and activist, Dr. Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor, the author of From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation. Thank you so much, Keeanga, for staying with us.
Sure.
If you have questions about Black Lives Matter or the movement for Black lives, you have questions about Black liberation, give us a call at 410-319-8888. We asked a number of teachers around the city to have their students read Dr. Taylor's book and to think about it and send her questions because she's willing to answer the questions about her book and engaging with her material. This student, this is a male student, he did gender identify. Dr. Taylor, he said he wants to be an activist / writer. He said he's been following your career for the last year or so, and he wanted to know, how do you go about doing your research? Like, what does that look like for you? Because he's having a hard time getting started.
I think that the internet has really made some of that a lot easier than it used to be. For the Black Lives Matter book, I read, a lot of newspaper articles. I read a lot of magazine articles, but I was also able, because I'm a professor, I was able to utilize some of the services of our library, which allow me to read old historical newspapers when I was, doing some of the chapters that look back much further in time. And so that can be more complicated for people who are not connected to an educational institution. But I think that, the resources that exist at the public library are often underutilized. And so I would say that the most important, thing, if you are looking to, to write about some of the situations or conditions that people experience today, is that you really have to read as much as possible to really have a handle on what those situations are, and to really make sure that you're making fact-based arguments. And so I think that there can be almost an overabundance of resources that are available today, but that it's important to, figure out how to utilize them to give your writing projects a certain kind of grounding.
Now, we want to open up the phone lines at 410-319-8888. We have Jasmine on the phone from Baltimore. Welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. You have a question for Dr. Taylor?
Yeah, my question is, you mentioned Black liberation, but my question is it possible to have Black liberation without the liberation of other oppressed groups and without the destruction of capitalism?
Thank you so much, Jasmine. So Dr. Taylor, she wants to know, can you get Black liberation without liberating everyone who is marginalized or oppressed, or without destroying capitalism?
Well, I write, pretty extensively about this idea in my book. I mean, I don't believe that in the United States that capitalism can actually function without racism. I think that any kind of system that is kind of reliant on a small group of people sitting atop of it has to figure out some kind of way to divide and oppressed a much larger population. And so to that extent, I think oppression itself is endemic to free market capitalism. And it takes, in this country, it takes a particular form around race. In other countries, it's around ethnicity, it's around religion, it's around nationalism. But wherever, capitalism is a global system, wherever it exists, it seeks to exploit differences between the mass of the population as a way that the very small group of people who have disproportionate access to wealth and resources is the way that they preserve their power. So to that extent, I think in the same way that Malcolm X said that you can't have capitalism without racism, and you can't have racism without capitalism. And so in terms of how one could transform that situation, I think that I would agree with the caller that you can't have Black liberation as this kind of state of existence within capitalism itself. And so to talk about creating the conditions for Black liberation, for Black people to be free, involves the freeing of all of our society, the freeing of all of humanity. And so that is why, I write a lot about the connections between different struggles, the need for solidarity, and the need to recognize the way that our what seem like separate struggles are actually connected to each other. They're related to each other, and that is a basis upon which we should think about our organizing and responses to the inequality that exists in this country.
Now, this student, in her class, she said that they actually read your speech, quote, the speech racists didn't want you to hear. And she has a question. She said they were actually reading it aloud in class. So you are inspiring a new generation of activists here in Baltimore City, Kianga. But she said she had a question about, and she wasn't sure if it was a quote by Wayne LaPierre, where it says, it's up to us to speak against the three most dangerous voices in America. Academic elites, political elites, and media elites. These are America's greatest domestic threats. Can you talk a little bit about that? Because when you think of domestic threats, you start thinking of academics, you get politicians and media, but where do we fit in this? In your work, where does it fit in this?
Well, to me, that's a very frightening quote from Wayne LaPierre, of course, is the vice president of the NRA. For the National Rifle Association to basically designate, academics as, or elected officials or, people in the media as the most, prominent threats in the United States is really chilling. And I think in the case of academics that this is part of an ongoing right-wing assault on the rights of academics to speak freely. They understand that the academy, at least as it's currently constituted, remains a place for people to engage in free speech, for people to be protected by academic freedom, which was invoked to, shield academics who deal in the realm of ideas and sometimes controversial ideas to be able to do so without threat of retribution or punishment. That's what academic freedom is at least in part for. And so I think the right wing with the NRA and all of these various, right-wing media sites that troll the speech and writing and social media activity of who they deem to be radical or left-wing faculty do so to try to silence people. So as much as they, like to portray themselves as victims of an attack on free speech, they are often the strongest advocates of restricting the free speech of people with whom they disagree and whose ideas that they don't support or share. They almost, they almost always protect or want to protect the rights of racist speech, of hate speech, of anti-immigrant speech, of homophobic speech, of sexist speech, while at the same time complaining fervently about the speech of radical critiques of U.S. foreign policy or of U.S. domestic policy, or radical critiques of the unfair and unequal economic arrangements in this country. And so to me, that disparity in treatment betrays a much larger agenda that says that actually they're not interested in free speech. They're interested in advancing the agenda of a conservative political clique that has a very narrow and small worldview that often excludes people who don't look like them, who don't think like them, and that's very dangerous. And so I think that for the political left, for people who see themselves as radicals or left-wingers, that free speech has always been critical as a way to, advance ideas about a different kind of way our society could be organized, a different conception of what the world could be like, the importance of speaking out against racism, of speaking out against war, of speaking out against the attacks on ordinary people. And so I think that's why we have to continue to put the struggle for the right to speak freely on campus at the forefront of our activities, and not, be silenced by the efforts of these conservative forces to use the cloak of free speech to advance an agenda of violence and reaction.
Well, we have one last question that came in from Malcolm. And Malcolm, I will make a note, asked me to say his name, Kianga. He said his teacher said that they get extra credit if their question makes it on the air. So Malcolm's question, isn't that hilarious? Malcolm's question is about Chapter 4 with the double standard of justice. He said, is there a way that you can connect Chapter 4 and the ways in which, black men, of course, criminalized to this lone wolf theory that we're debating about now, particularly in the ways in which white males, of course, are categorized as lone wolves, as if they're acting alone. Could you draw a comparison to us in your last couple of minutes before you go?
I mean, I'm not sure about the comparison. I think that crime is racialized in different ways in this country. And so for African Americans, when a person commits a crime, it's used as as representative of all black people. And so in some ways, the community of African Americans must be represented in that. At least that's how the political establishment uses those kinds of statistics. Whereas when, white individuals commit crimes, it's seen as individual acts, as, almost inexplicable acts that are done, for whatever reasons that motivated this particular individual. And I think that part of that just is a demonstration of how everything that happens in our society is subject to political politicalization by the political establishment. And so the politicizing what is perceived to be as black crime creates the opportunity for the political establishment to argue for more funding for police, to argue for bolstering the criminal justice system. And it's really, continuing to maintain the various apparatus of the state to keep that intact. Whereas the crimes that are committed by, white people are a way of, not having any kind of systematic effort to understand it. Instead, there's an immediate kind of disavowal that this person could have had any other motivation than mental illness. And so we never get any sort of deeper interrogation or investigation into, specific threats that organized white people have had, whether it's the growth of white supremacist organizations or white nationalist organizations, white successionist movements or separatism. We don't get any deeper look into that because it's immediately dismissed as an individual act. And so these just provide more opportunities, to think about how everything, whether it's crime, whether it's, distribution of funds for public schools, is subject to, political rhetoric and being politicized in our country.
Well, thank you so much, Keeanga-Yamahtta Taylor. She's a writer, public speaker, activist, and assistant professor at the Center for African American Studies at Princeton University. She's the author From Black Lives Matter to Black Liberation and the forthcoming How We Get Free. Keeanga, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. You guys have a great day.
Thank you. So we don't want you to go anywhere because in the last couple of minutes of the show, I'm going to open up the phone lines. John, don't go anywhere from Ellicott City. Stay with us. I'll get to you first. But I want to talk about black politics, the state of black politics, the comparison of voting rights from Jim Crow to 2017, black liberation, Black Lives Matter versus All Lives Matter. We're going to have that story that matters here on Today with Dr. Kaye. Stay with me. I'm Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead, and this is Today with Dr. Kaye. The phone lines are now open. John from Ellicott City, how are you?
I'm enjoying your show, and you've thrown out so many topics. Let me just carve out a little small piece.
Thank you, sir.
I kind of wanted to ask the author has she written off the political process to accomplish social change. Let me throw out a couple of things. I'm going to move out of the way for others. Some givens. We have 13% of the population. We are not going to change the economic system that's already in place and heavily invested. We don't have the bullets to overthrow the government. And I think the last election, the election of Donald Trump, who has really set back, just by reverse, all of the progress that Obama had made in the area of criminal justice reform, affirmative action, you name it, was primarily due to the failure of that Obama coalition of minority groups, and a major part of it. And we didn't turn out in some of in the major urban areas in the numbers that we did for him, although no one did expect it, but it was so much of a fall off, it led to the election of Donald Trump. We have to form coalitions.
Right.
A lot of this talk about black liberation, you cannot. I worked in Washington for over 20 years, closely around the legislative process. It is not moved by just strictly individuals organizing around one another. There's a lot of money in politics, and that's from the local level up to the national level. Politicians are elected. Money, leads to the election. And we as black people, we don't volunteer the way we should, nor do we contribute money to political campaigns.
Thank you so much, John from Ellicott City. So he has raised a couple of different and interesting ideas in terms of how do we obtain social objectives? Where are we giving our money to? I mean, it's interesting that I once heard someone say that if I want to know what you care about, I simply have to open up your checkbook, because the things that we care about, we put our money to, we put our time to. I think a lot about that because I am someone where it's clear how I give my time. I pour a lot of my time into my sons, into trying to help create a world where they can learn how to do the hard work. They can learn how to make their voice known, that I'm teaching them early on about advocacy, but I also spend my time trying to do coalition building, trying to be out in the community and working with people who are looking to dismantle this current infrastructure, which is very clear it is not working for people of color in this country. But as we dismantle it, what do we put in its place? If you have comments about that, give me a call at 410-319-8888. This is Today with Dr. Kaye, and I am Dr. Kaye Wise Whitehead, and I'm kind of thinking through what Dr. Taylor laid out for us. How do we get free? What does freedom look like? I heard a speaker when I was in Cincinnati last weekend at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, ASALH. I was at their convention, and one speaker, Dr. Treva Lindsay, who will be joining our show on the Writer with Writers, she said she's not even sure if she wants to be free if it doesn't mean that everybody can be free. And it wasn't it Dr. King that talked about this notion that if there's oppression or inequality anywhere, then it actually impacts everyone. That how do you celebrate freedom? How do you enjoy your freedom if everyone is not coming along with you? The theory I'd like to throw out now, as you are hopefully pulling over and looking to give me a call at 410-319-8888, is this notion of Black rage. There is a book that's out now called White Rage, and everyone's talking about it. But I remember the older book, Black Rage, which looked at the impact of systemic inequality and the impact of racism on the Black psychology. What did it matter to us to be in this situation? What does it mean for us to have to wrestle through some of these big issues? What does it feel like when we're dealing with microaggressions? I think about that as I go through the day. Sometimes I have one microaggression after another, and it's like death by 1,000 microaggressions that, I go into a store and I'm standing in line and people don't see me standing there and they call on the person who just happens to be white standing behind me. Or I go on campus and students may push into me and it's almost like I'm not there. It's like death by 1,000 microaggressions. And it does feed into this notion of Black rage. How do you express it? I have Patricia on the line. Patricia, welcome to Today with Dr. Kaye.
Well, thank you, Dr. Kaye. It's been really a pleasure to be listening and to this. And I'm a white woman who haven't grown up in Maryland, and I'm 62 years old. And your guest said something really great, important question about what do we replace,
right,
this horrible system with. And one of the thoughts I had was that we don't wait to replace it. We start it now. We start it within our own communities, whatever kind of bonding we can make and the systems we can make that are starting and working. And then as the movement becomes bigger, maybe we'll have smaller ones in place that can be really good models. And my other thought was when she was talking so eloquently about, who's bearing the burden of white supremacy and white racism.
Right.
White people, it hurts us too because we are grown up with this weird denial, right? We're supposed to be like in the land of the free, home of the brave, and we're supposed to believe all this BS. And then we get older and then we look around and we realize, wow, So there's a huge psychic cost, which is why so many of us are crazy. And I just want to say, thank you for your work. And there's a lot of allies out there, and love one another.
Thank you so much, Patricia. Unfortunately, there's something going on with the phones tonight, and we are losing a lot of people. We thank you for calling, and we invite you to call back at 410-319-8888. And we're struggling with the question, how can we get free? And whether or not freedom is something that we actually can achieve, and is it really freedom if nobody comes along with us? I think about something that my youngest son once said, Amir. He once said, can we just see, revolution as a thunderstorm, mommy, and let's just run out and get wet? Like that idea, let's get wet with this notion of freedom. And let's see there's something that we can actually achieve. I was reading Derek Bell's book, Faces at the Bottom of the Well, and some of you know that book. But he argued that racism is a permanent part of America, and that we are all best off recognizing that fact. Is racism something that is a permanent part of America? Is it something that we cannot pull out of? Is it something that we can't kind of separate ourselves from? I tend to see it, I guess, more of a melting pot than an American quilt. And I teach my students at Loyola about this notion of the American quilt, that we stitch together all of these different nationalities and cultures and language, and we make this huge blanket that we call America. But Derek Bell is talking about America as a melting pot, that racism becomes a part of the stew, that there's no way you can remove racism from the melting pot because it's cooked in with everything else. That's kind of scary when you think about it. I mean, if you think about wanting to imagine another type of America, if you think about wanting to dismantle the current state in Baltimore City, if you think about how we have normalized the criminality of the black body, how we have normalized oppression, we've normalized stereotypes, we've normalized people being oppressed, and the only way that we can change that is to imagine something else. So I'm going to have you wrestle with these questions overnight. Listeners, I'm going to give you a bit of homework here on Today with Dr. Kaye. Your homework is to think about how we can change the system. Think about the ways that we can dream out loud. Think about the ways that we can challenge ourselves to be different. And as you do that, we will look to talk about it tomorrow. So we'll leave it right here. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your drive time with me. I am Dr. Kaye Whitehead. I want you to stay tuned for your MTA update. Today with Dr. Kaye is a production of WEAA. The show is produced by host Dr. Carsonia Wise-Whitehead and producer Iyore Ozigi-Duwa. Our board operators are Andre Melton and Isaiah George. Our interns are Tamara Giles, Anissa Morales, and Petra Dormand. Stay tuned for Faraji Muhammad with For the Culture. I am Dr. Kaye Whitehead, and this has been Today with Dr. Kaye. Join us again tomorrow for more conversations about stuff that matters, and have your homework done. Right here on Public Radio, WEAA 88.9 FM, the voice of the community.